turned out for a public hearing. Well, the white Aryan resistance also decided to do a show of force at that hearing in their full Nazi stormtrooper regalia. This is pre-internet, so instead of a website, they had a hotline where you could call and hear racist invective and find out who had testified at that hearing. Well, many of the elders in that community, the merchants who had come out to testify, it was their first experience with participation in the democratic process, and they were frightened away and were very unlikely to come out again as the debate continued around this issue of political discourse. If you think about why we disallow defamation or we impose legal penalties for it, it's because reputation is part of the self, and it's part of the self that's needed to participate equally in the democratic conversation. If you lose standing in the community, you lose liberty. The freedom to move about as a respected person, to speak credibly, to join your fellow citizens in this grand social contract that we call democracy. Your reputation is valuable, and thus we will restrain speech when it takes your reputation from you. And I submit that there are forms of assaultive speech that have very much the same effect. I've asked for 30 years why we penalize someone who calls a doctor a quack, but we won't penalize someone who says that by race, the doctor is inherently worthless and properly subject to extermination. I haven't received an answer. If you believe, as I do, that unbridled freedom to wound with words and to incite through propaganda can harm the very freedom that we intend to protect by protecting speech, then I suggest that you vote against the proposition. The other side will tell you we can't start down that path of deciding which speech is acceptable, or we become trapped in the censorship business. This is a rhetorical move that lawyers call the slippery slope. What the other side will not tell you is that we are already on the slippery slope of tolerating censorship of certain forms of speech, including libel, fraud, copyright infringement, conversations and restraint of trade. There is no easy and absolute way out. We do have to decide when, where, and how we will limit speech. The call of the question here uses the word offensive. But let me make clear that none of us would be engaged in this debate if we were just talking about table manners or humorous insults with political purpose, the right to offend that Signe Wilkinson is talking about. If we say that we are closing the door, taking an absolutist position, giving a free license to those who would use words to assault, we're doing much more than just allowing political cartoons, which I think should be protected absolutely, and that we can discern how to do that under our legal system. But what I'm really getting at is words that are used to and intended to wound and to stop people from equal participation in society. I teach torts, and in torts the students...
Your time is up. If
Oh.
you can finish your
Okay.
sentence, but...
I've got 4 sentences. And they're short ones. Okay.
So,
all right, I'm going to go...
Why
I'm going to go...
don't you give the 4 sentences during
I will.
the question?
May I take them from my 2-minute closing?
My God, they didn't tell me about this kind of thing. Sure. Yeah, we'll deduct them from the...
Okay.
The end.
If I spit on your shoe, you can sue me for that. It's called a battery. There are words that I could use that would have the same effect on your psyche, your personhood, your ability to move freely. And yet, if you vote for this proposition, you're saying that that form of assault is allowed. It happens in this city and elsewhere in our country. A student comes to the university on the eve of Yom Kippur and finds swastikas. All right, this is it.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. Vote no.
Philip Gourevitch.
Extraordinary how people who want to silence public speech won't shut up. We're faced tonight with people who want to start cartooning, but who make a caricature of the concept of free speech. They are not here to discuss free speech. They are here to discuss their deep conviction that speech is not free and therefore should not be free. That is essentially what the previous speaker said. She says there is no free speech, let's be real, and therefore there should be no free speech, and we should simply start restricting it endlessly. Since we are being cartooned as the monstrous side, let me begin with a monstrous image. In northern Uganda, for the last 15, 20 years, there has been a movement known as the Lord's Resistance Army. It practices its warfare in the name of God, and what it does when it dislikes the speech that is being made is that it cuts off the lips of the citizens who are speaking, and it puts padlocks through punctured holes in their lips and shuts them. I'm afraid that I'm very much unable to picture these people doing that, but it's very clear to me that that is what they wish to do. I will return to this image at the end, but that is the image that clearly you must bear in mind as you, the jury tonight, vote on the question of whether we shall be permitted to speak or whether we shall be inclined to silence anybody with whom we find offense, in whom we find offense. And that is what they're saying. Who are they to judge what is offensive? Surely you have different ideas. Surely we all have different ideas. And yet somehow the concept of offense is being proposed by the other side as some sort of universal measure of civilization rather than the opposite. But one point of agreement that we have is that speech is fiercely powerful and can be intensely dangerous. I spent some time reporting from Rwanda in the aftermath of the genocide there, and one of the most striking things, the previous speaker referred to genocide, is that in the course of this genocide, a great deal of the genocide was incited by public speech, by radio speech, by incitement through words. And the words were used as hate speech, which you will find that the other side thinks should be censored because it is dangerous. The hate speech said, invariably, kill the minority, the Tutsis. They didn't always say it directly. They used euphemisms. The euphemisms would be phrases like, do your work, clear the bush, do not let a weed escape the blade. These were phrases that were well understood in the historical context, and they were clearly hate speech. There's no ambiguity about it. Those people have been tried and convicted for inciting mass murder in their country. The problem there was not free speech for haters. It was that this was the officially sanctioned speech by people who prohibited sanity from being free speech. Anybody who protested against the genocide was silenced as offensive. Offensive speech, my goodness, that Hutus and Tutsis should live side by side in comity, that they should allow each other to exist. How offensive. Let's silence them. Let's murder them. Let us have official speech. That was the position. And that is the position which, yes, ma'am, slippery slope. It's not a slippery slope. It's a greased precipice off which they wish to push you. Because once you start to say that racist speech or blasphemous speech is somehow or other offensive, you're immediately on the quick descent towards book burning. And the books that you wish to burn are the books that include, let's say, Huck Finn, where racist words are used in possibly the 19th century's most noble portrait of a black man in America, where blasphemous speech is used by Ahab. Most people who are burning books, of course, are too illiterate to notice. But let's focus on the facts. They consistently elevate idiotic speech, like Holocaust denial, to a greatly important role by saying, let us illegalize it, challenge it in courts, give these people a tremendous platform, and prove that they're wrong, when no sane person can possibly suspect that this is serious history. So we're going to have to elevate them in order to silence them, rather than to ignore them, to discuss it with them, but rather we have, I would like to quote to you a short passage from David Cesarani, which he wrote, celebrating Austria's law criminalizing Holocaust denial. This was in The Guardian. Thanks to the internet, he claims, it is virtually impossible to stop the dissemination of lies and propaganda these days. The classical arguments of freedom of speech drawn from Voltaire and Mill are redundant. So we have an anti-Enlightenment argument, very strongly stated. They addressed small literate elites at a time when the means of reproduction were relatively few and easily controlled, when it was reasonable to contend that in a contest between truth and falsehood held among reasonable men, lies would be exposed and driven from the public sphere. But the internet is awash with falsehood and bigotry. Good ideas and beautiful truths coexist with trash and outright evil. Heaven forfend that bad ideas should be out there. Amid this anarchy, he says, all that decent people can do is agree to reasonable limits on what can be said and set down legal markers in an attempt to preserve a democratic, civilized, and tolerant society. That's what he says. I say, who gives him the right to set up a chair in the antechambers of my mind and judge what I'm allowed to say and what I'm allowed to think? Is that what you want? Is that who you want? How does it avail the cause of civilization, sir, to fight brown shirts with brown shirt tactics? I would like to know that.